Oh, guys, welcome back. Welcome back. So happy to see you after the difficult but important conversation of Chapter 4 on civil liberties, a chapter in which you and I may have perfectly reasonable disagreements because we have competing values that butt heads with one another. Now we talk about civil rights here in Chapter 5. And civil rights is a different concept. I know it starts with civil, but it is a different concept than civil liberties. So please make sure you understand the difference. Now, civil liberties are all about protecting us from the powers of government. That's what civil liberties in Chapter 4 are all about. Now we talk about civil rights, a chapter that maybe doesn't pit as many of the moral quandaries and reasonable debates, although there are some that can spring out of this one. Matter of fact, let me just walk that back. There's plenty of reasonable debates that we had over civil rights. Matter of fact, we'll be talking about a couple of them. But civil rights are different because civil rights are about the government protecting us from the prejudices of each other. So we shall dive into this subject now. Maybe I would not rank this with the compelling moral quandaries of Chapter 4, but Chapter 5 may be one of the most important that we learn about, okay? Now, let's begin the conversation, as we always do, by defining our critical term. What are civil rights, guys? And here's your definition. It's fine. It's really that first part, equal protection under the law, no matter what demographic of person you're in. That's what makes civil rights civil rights. We are talking about equal protection under the law. And it doesn't matter what demographic of person in it. Anytime somebody says, hey, I'm not being treated equally because of the demographic of person I'm in, because of the category of person I am. Now, that wouldn't make much sense for me to say, as I am your standard, white, Christian, straight male, so I'm kind of in the majorities across the board. But for certain minorities, if you are claiming, hey, I'm being treated unfairly because of the category of person I'm in, you're making a civil rights argument. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, we often associate civil rights with African Americans and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. That's justifiable. That's justifiable for associating with that. But that's only one type of civil rights, and that's over, of course, African Americans. Anytime anybody's claiming they're being treated unequally because of the category of person they're in, they're making a civil rights argument. Maybe it's somebody like women. Maybe it's African Americans, the LGBT community, individuals not yet born, Native Americans, foreign nationals, the poor, the homeless, the disabled, felons, former and current, drug addicts. 16-year-olds could argue they're being treated unfairly for any number of reasons. The elderly, children, Latinos, Pacific Islanders, Muslims, communists, single mothers, the deaf and the blind, non-English speakers, the illiterate, prisoners. You get the idea. You don't need to know this list. I'm not asking you to know this list. I'm just giving you some examples of categories of Americans that could argue I'm being treated unequally because of this or that. Now, you don't have to agree with the arguments they're making. Okay, like for instance, 16-year-olds may make a civil rights argument saying, wait a minute, America, you're okay with us driving gigantic metallic death machines on the road, but you're not okay with us voting? How is that possible? Maybe you're giving people who are 18 the right to vote, but people who are 17 and 8 are basically 18. They deserve a right to vote too. 16 is basically 17. We deserve a right to vote too. Now, do you agree with that? Do you agree that 16-year-olds should get a right to vote? What do you think? There's no right answer there. There's an answer you feel is correct, but there's no objectively correct answer. I was just reading an article the other day about how the economy is built for morning people, and that's discriminatory against night owls, people who are late morning people or people that are awake primarily at night. I don't know. That might be a step too far even for me, but still, at the end of the day, if you are arguing that you're being discriminated because of the category of person you're in, you're arguing a civil rights argument. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're right. It doesn't necessarily mean other people have to agree with you, but that is the category of argument that you're making. Now, anytime, despite all these different groups, anytime we talk about civil rights, we always start with the African-American experience, and rightly so. It is, in fact, as we've talked about in Chapter 2, America's deal with the devil that, for for the first however long that our society was a thing, we subjected African Americans to slavery. They languished in slavery for centuries. Matter of fact, since this land was discovered, we have had slavery longer than we haven't had slavery. So it is a centuries-long project here in America. That being said, we start to make the first inroads for African American rights with what I like to nickname the Civil War Amendments. The Civil War Amendments all were passed shortly after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. And keep in mind, make sure you know what each of these amendments gives us broadly, okay? And I say broadly because the 14th Amendment gives us like 1,000 things. So I just really want you to focus on the top line thing for this conversation. Now let's start with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is actually the abolition of slavery. This is actually the first time that slavery is mentioned in the Constitution, is in the 13th Amendment, is not mentioned anywhere else by name in the Constitution. It's alluded to, but this is the first time slavery appears and is in with the abolition of slavery. Now the 14th Amendment says that, okay, so we have slavery with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment offers citizenship. So long as you're born in America, you get citizenship. You can't have your life, and that with citizenship means you get a whole range of rights, the most critical of which mentioned in the 14th Amendment is that you can't have your life, liberty, or property taken without due process. The 14th Amendment actually gives us 100 things, but one of the reasons why we talk about equal protection is because of the 14th Amendment, but that's neither here nor there right now. Make sure you understand, 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment offers what we call birthright citizenship. So long as you're born in America, you have the privileges of citizenship. And the 15th Amendment offers the right to vote to anybody. Well, actually, let me clarify that, because it doesn't actually do that. What it does is it says you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of race. You can't deny the vote on the basis of race. Now, it's a mixed record here. We are okay at this point as a nation. We do an okay job at eliminating slavery. There are pockets of it still over time that we have to kind of unravel and undo. But it's okay at eliminating pure slavery the way that we think of it here in kind of our pop culture thinking. But generally speaking, it was not very effective. These amendments were not very effective at guaranteeing equal treatment. There's any number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because of the court system. The court system was very aggressive at negating these amendments. Sure, they were put there by super majorities across the board, but nonetheless, the courts weighed in, first of all, and said that while it's true, these amendments say you can't discriminate against people of color on this issue or that issue, we're really just talking about the government. It's really only the government that can't discriminate. Private citizens, discriminate all you want. So if that does, and that's of course where we get the scourge of the whites only, stores that are like, well, we're a private store, we're only going to serve white people, we're only going to hire white people, all that good stuff. That doesn't mean that, obviously over the course of history we undo some of those prejudices, but nonetheless, courts said that all this stuff about guaranteeing equal rights really only applies to the government. We, the people, can be discriminatory towards each other. On top of that, there was the scourge of Plessy v. Ferguson, which is a historical error, of course, by America, one of many. But what it argued was that, yes, you must treat African Americans equally. You must. It's clearly in the Constitution that you must. However, it doesn't say anything about keeping all the races together. So what we can do, and again, you have to think in a sinister way. You have to think about racists in the 1800s. How can we keep the races separate still? One way you can do it is by these separate but equal laws that the Constitution said were acceptable. That the courts said were acceptable and constitutional. So we'll have a white school and we'll have a black school. And of course, we turn out to be very good at the separating part, but we end up being pretty darn lousy at the equality part. That ends up being a pretty big weakness in our game. The idea that black schools and white schools are equal is laughable. All the resources went to the white schools. Black schools were, very poorly resourced. And the instructors very poorly compensated. Matter of fact, here at OTC, the Lincoln Building was a segregated school. The Lincoln Building here at OTC was a black-only school for a period of time. And, of course, there are voting barriers put in place as well. Now, voting barriers, you might say, that's not allowed. The 15th Amendment says anybody can vote. That's not what the 15th Amendment says. Read the 15th Amendment, at least how I've paraphrased it here. The 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied to anybody on the basis of race. So we can't say, hey, black people, you can't vote because you're black. That violates the 15th Amendment. But if we can come up with other things that black people have in common, aside from the color of their skin, and ban those, well, we're not banning it on the basis of race necessarily, at least so goes the thinking. Let me give you some example. Here's some voting barriers used against African Americans. That's not my, that's not my best abbreviation up there, but African Americans is what we're talking about, okay? Once again, we can't discriminate on the basis of your race, but if we can find other things that you and your race have in common and ban those, then maybe we can get away with these voting barriers. One thing that that the courts established was they said the government couldn't discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to voting. However, political parties at the time were perfectly allowed to. So we'll talk about primaries more in Chapter 8. But first of all, before the general election, where we are actually deciding who ascends to an office, we're having an election that decides who is going to be the Republican in this race, who is going to be the Democrat in this race. Those are primaries, and many political primaries at the time were white primaries that only allowed white people to vote. On top of that, there's also the grandfather clause. You could only vote if your grandfather had vote. Keep in mind, if you are a newly freed person, chances are your ancestors weren't exactly voters. They weren't allowed by the laws of the time. So that does mean that we are not discriminating against you, so the theory goes, on the basis of your race. We're finding something else that people of your race have in common. And it turns out to be non-voting grandfathers. Now, on top of that, they also tried poll taxes. Again, if you were new, this is a poll tax note that you see right here. If you are a newly freed person, chances are you probably didn't have a lot of money. And $1 in 1918 is actually the equivalent of $20 today, more or less. As a result, who doesn't have $20 to vote for your one vote? Poor people don't. And of course, if you're newly freed, you probably were on the poor end of the economic spectrum. We're not banning you from voting because you're black. We're banning you from voting because you're not paying a poll tax. There are also literacy tests, which was not particularly fair because African Americans, newly freed African Americans, probably got zero education, didn't know how to read. If you were educated in a black-only school, chances are your education wasn't given a lot of resources. There's a chance you didn't learn to read while you were in school. So literacy tests, all this stuff is geared towards keeping African Americans from voting. Now, keep in mind, the courts largely allowed these prejudiced acts to occur. And it's kind of a natural thing of like with the courts giving, but the courts then eventually taking away. The courts end up ruling a bunch of the stuff you're seeing up here unconstitutional. Poll taxes in particular end up getting banned specifically in the 24th Amendment. That's not always the easiest thing to remember, is that poll taxes were banned in Amendment 24. I was actually reading this article a couple years ago that was giving me instructions for how to remember all the amendments, though, because I have trouble remembering all the amendments. And this article said, if you're trying to remember the 24th Amendment, think of this. On December 24th, Santa Claus wants to leave the North Pole. Okay, so that's what I read. And I remember reading that and thinking, that is the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard for a mnemonic device. And yet here I am 2 years later, perfect memory of the 24th Amendment. Once again, the 24th Amendment guarantees that poll taxes can't be used to ban you from a polling station. The Supreme Court also undid its Plessy v. Ferguson ruling with Brown v. Board of Education. Separate but equal was greenlit in Plessy v. Ferguson, but yeah, Brown v. Board of Education, the court ruled that separate but equal, that segregation was effectively, effectively denying equal rights to African Americans. On top of that, as a result now, segregation of all kinds is not allowed. You can't send black people here and white people there, and any kind. No business can do that. No government entity, including schools, can do that. Now, let's take some time to talk about the civil rights of the 1960s as we kind of march our way through American history here. The civil rights of the 1960s is what we traditionally think of when we think about civil rights, and specifically civil rights for African Americans. But we need to make sure we understand something, that despite the fact this was a massive movement for increased rights for our African American brothers and sisters, it actually had multiple different leaders with multiple different agendas. Now, one of the agendas we don't read about a whole lot, as much as we do about Martin Luther King, is, of course, Malcolm X. Let's take a little time to talk about Malcolm X. And again, there's a PLS 101 course. You can have an entire course on civil rights alone, especially African American civil rights. So everything I'm doing right now, everything I'm giving you is a crude nutshell. Please accept my apologies that I'm not being as thorough as I could. I could be a lot more thorough, but this video would be like 4 hours long. Okay? I think it's fine the length it is. I think you probably agree. Now, Malcolm X was a little bit more militant in his views when fighting for African American rights. Unlike Martin Luther King, who we'll talk about later, Martin Luther King would argue that the white population is mistaken and can be convinced. Malcolm X argued that the white population of America willfully is racist. They willfully built our society on the foundation of racism, and that white people, it's not that they're not treating black people the same mistakenly. They just believe, white people inherently believe that they are superior, that they are endowed by their creator as being the greater race, and therefore can subjugate and discriminate against our African American neighbors in our society. Now, for the record, Malcolm X argues that our creator actually disagrees. There is in fact a superior race. This is one of the arguments he was making early on, before he kind of mellowed out in his later years. But there is a superior race, and it's not the white race, it's our race, and we need to take what's ours by any means necessary. Now, by any means necessary does open the door some to militancy and violence. It does open the door to that some, which stands in stark contrast to Martin Luther King. But you can kind of remember these characters by their modern pop culture metaphors. If you ever watch any X-Men movies or any X-Men TV shows or read any X-Men comics, you'll notice there's a lot of Magneto here. Lots of Magneto in Malcolm X's militancy. Magneto, of course, is a mutant, a fictional character. He's a mutant. He believes that mankind subjugates unfairly mutants and believes that they are better than the freaks of the mutant world. And yet the mutant world, so says Magneto, is actually the superior race and therefore should actually subjugate humanity. Right? Now, I don't know if subjugating white people was exactly what Malcolm X was going for, but clearly the any means necessary, and our creator is actually arguing that the white race is necessarily the lesser race. That was a big part of his militancy early on. Now, if we have a Malcolm X is our Magneto, clearly our Professor X of the X-Men world is Martin Luther King Jr. And matter of fact, when you think about it, Professor X should have been like up here because of the X commonality, but still, Martin Luther King, just like the fictional Professor X, arguing for mutants, argues that maybe we can be a little bit more diplomatic, a little more savvy in our politics here. First of all, he believed that nonviolence is the best way to get the upper hand, and the white community, when exposed to the nonviolent protests of African Americans, will eventually be shown a better way. They are mistaken in their preference for white superiority. They will be shown the error of their ways if we embrace civil disobedience. And civil disobedience means you are breaking the law peacefully. That's what civil disobedience means. You are breaking the law peacefully. Now, this is where you get a bunch of the sit-ins. This is where you get a bunch of the marches. This is where you get a bunch of the occupations of like voting, the occupations of streets in front of where voter registration drives go. But we actually use civil disobedience in a lot of different ways, aside from just against racism. We also use it to protest like civil liberties. Some people will, I remember there's a story years and years ago, I can't remember the facts of the story exactly, but there was a guy, the TSA since 9/11 has increased their security measures to ostensibly protect people from entering a plane with weapons. And yet this guy, to protest the TSA's increased security checks, snuck a bunch of weapons on a plane. And as the plane's sitting on the runway, the guy stands up and he says, "Hey, I don't want to alarm anybody, but I've just snuck a lot of weapons on this plane." Gets arrested, go to jail. He broke the law peacefully to illustrate a point. And that point, of course, is that the TSA may embrace these methods, but it won't necessarily make us safer on a plane. Now, I don't know if you want to agree with that point or disagree with it, but that's what we're talking about here. The point is if we embrace nonviolent solutions, we can win over more and more people. That was the Martin Luther King general philosophy. Again, I know that's the crudest of nutshells, but that's how we're going to kind of handle this with that in order to make the lecture an appropriate length of time. Couldn't find my rag. All right. Let's keep humming along and talk about the end result of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act won over two massive pieces of legislation. One of them was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The other is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Combined, here's the gist of what they gave us. The first thing that happened was that it illegalized discrimination on the basis of race when it comes to having access to businesses and employment. If you are hiring, you must consider all applicants regardless of their race on an equal footing. If you are a business that is serving like muffins to citizens, then if there are black citizens that come in and they want to buy your muffins, you got to sell to them if you're also selling to white citizens as well. On top of that, it also gave the federal government more leverage in suing school districts for segregation practices and for not properly integrating. And on top of that, it guaranteed a bunch of different federal protections for the right to vote that African Americans didn't previously have. Give you a minute on that. I think I went through that kind of fast. So when it comes to segregation, it comes in a couple different flavors. One of these is de jure segregation, which is segregation by law. And this is law that says black people go this way, white people go that way. That's anytime the government's doing that. Okay, different races go different directions. That's called de jure segregation. And we don't really see as much of that anymore, but we do still see a fair share of de facto segregation, where we essentially segregate ourselves, or we are segregated, maybe we weren't intended to be segregated, but that's what ends up happening. Now, de facto segregation does happen with in many different ways in our lives, but one thing you maybe have heard of is something called white flight. In some suburban neighborhoods, if people of color start moving in, a certain population of white people might start moving out, and populations kind of end up self-sorting that way, where you have neighborhoods that are kind of heavily one race. And we see that in a lot of different societies, kind of somewhat by purpose. You have like Italian neighborhoods and more Asian type American neighborhoods and maybe more African American friendly or Latino friendly neighborhoods. So that's segregation by practice. And that being said, even though that we have come a long way when it comes to racism, prejudice, and segregation, we are still seeing challenges to a bunch of this stuff today. Like, for instance, in 2013, the Voting Rights Act was largely gutted. The part that said that if certain districts have exhibited racial prejudice in the past, that the federal government can jump in and overtake their elections. And surely enough, the Supreme Court said, can't do that anymore. You can do that. The federal government can jump in and take over for states who have exhibited racist pasts, but you need to update the list of who these districts are. Now, Congress since hasn't done that, and as a result, we have seen controversial voter ID laws, which predominantly affect urban populations and people of color. These laws are a relatively new phenomenon of the 21st century. We have never in the past demanded, I shouldn't say never, but we have rarely in the past demanded identification when you go to vote. But we have passed these laws knowing that populations that are people of color, they are less likely to have IDs on them, and therefore this law, while it might break a few eggs to get to the omelet of discrimination, is nonetheless going to be effective at keeping some black populations from voting reliably. With that in mind, concern over voter fraud is serious among Americans, even though I'm just going to be honest with you guys, there's not a ton of evidence that any voter fraud is that serious at all. We have like double-digit numbers voter fraud cases over the last couple decades. That's just a minuscule number. But nonetheless, we pass laws to try to increase the security of our elections, to increase the integrity of our elections. The blowback is that we end up with black populations, entire black populations that struggle to vote relative to white populations. All right, that's our conversation on civil rights. Let's take a little time to talk about women's rights, another very important civil rights conversation to have. Obviously, women did not start off in America with a ton of rights either. Very few rights. Now, the sea change for women's rights starts also around the middle of the 19th century. Middle of the 19th century, you start seeing a lot of people talk about abolition on slavery, start talking about more rights for African Americans, and naturally the conversation bleeds into more rights for women. Most prominent part of this is the women's suffrage movement. Note that date, 1869. This is after the conclusion of the Civil War. Black people are starting to see some more rights coming their way, and Susan B. Anthony believes that we can capitalize on this spirit by fighting for women's suffrage, which is a fancy way of saying women's right to vote. I don't know why we use that word suffrage. It sounds like they're in pain, right? It sounds like they're suffering. But no, I'm talking about a women's right to vote. And Susan B. Anthony is like the lead suffragette. Make sure you know her. She ends up leading the charge to try to convince as many people as possible to allow women to vote. Now, like I said, it didn't make a ton of progress, but it did begin the conversation. And sure enough, 50 years later, you have the 19th Amendment. Here's the exact language of the 19th Amendment. I don't care if you know the exact language of the 19th Amendment, but it is arguing that the right of citizens shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of sex or on the account of sex. Matter of fact, Susan B. Anthony is a perfect instance of losing the battle but winning the war. When the 19th Amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution, it at the time was nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So obviously, since the 19th Amendment was passed, we have still had a lot of ground to make up as far as equality between men and women. In particular, the people carrying the torch for better rights for women are what we call feminists. And feminism gets a little bit of a bad rap in American public policy. Let's make sure we understand exactly what feminism is arguing. Feminism is not arguing to subjugate men or to give rights to women at the expense of men necessarily. It's arguing that women should be treated equally to men. Now, I'm willing to bet just about every person listening to this video agrees with that. And if you do agree with that, then you are a feminist, or you at least have feminist leanings in you. Now, I don't know why people are agreeing with the feminist philosophy but disagreeing with the feminist label. If I ever hear phrases like feminazi ever again, I will lose my mind. That's not what feminists are looking to do. They're not looking to, again, completely change society unless what we're doing there is fighting for better equality for women. I don't know if I explained that well. But anyways, what we have seen is a series of feminist victories over the last several decades. In particular, we had in the Civil Rights Act, you had Title VII. Title VII prohibited gender discrimination in employment as well. So you can't put out a sign saying whites only or men only. Women must also be allowed to apply. You also have Title IX, which prohibits gender discrimination in education and in government assistance. Matter of fact, Title IX is one of the reasons why America is baller when it comes to female athletes. That's the thing you notice every time there's an Olympics, is that women from America destroy the women from every other country in our athletics. And that's because, thanks to Title IX, we have invested a ton in female athletes here in America relative to other countries. Women, by the way, can now serve in the military. That's a victory of the last few decades. On top of that, they have better avenues now to deal with sexual harassment at work. It is far from ideal. Sexual harassment, according to the surveys we see from women, is still very sadly universal. That sadly is something that almost all women have to deal with. I hope it's nothing you ever have to deal with, but you know, it's a little bit better to deal with sexual harassment now than it used to be. On top of that, you have better avenues to deal with wage inequality if you notice that you're being paid differently than men for doing the exact same job. Now, prior to this Lilly Ledbetter Act, which is what this is called, the Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed in 2009. Oh, sorry, Lilly Ledbetter Act is passed in 2009. You don't see very well here. Oh well. Anyways, what this law was trying to do was change up what it takes for a woman to sue her employer for unfair pay. Prior to the Lilly Ledbetter Act, if you are a woman, you can sue your employer, but you only have 6 months to sue from when you start. That's unreal. That's unrealistic. I mean, who gets a job and spends the first 6 months surveying her coworkers for who's getting paid what? What the Lilly Ledbetter Act did was it keeps the 6-month window intact, but the clock doesn't start until you find out that you're being paid unequally. I will also mention that thanks to some of the enterprising women we have seen in American politics, they have really paved the way for more women to enter the political realm. After all, look at this chart right here going all the way to 2020. One thing you'll notice is we have more women being elected right now than we have ever seen in American history. So obviously we have a lot more candidates running, a lot more women winning, and we're nowhere near 50-50 in the Senate, and we're nowhere near 50-50 in the House. That's what we deserve. As Americans, we deserve 50% women in the House and the Senate. We're not close to that, but as you can see, we're trending in the right direction. All right, we have taken some time to talk about civil rights regarding the African American experience, regarding women's rights. Let's take a little bit of time to talk about rights for LGBTQ folks. And the thing to notice about LGBTQ rights is that they have almost all happened in your lifetime. They are very new. This is not something like women's rights, which took decades of work, or African American rights, which took maybe a century plus of work. Instead, LGBTQ has been, the rights for LGBTQ folks has happened very quickly. Just to kind of recap, for the vast majority of American history, we have stigmatized homosexuality here in America. And in doing so, this has led to lots of perfectly legal discrimination against gay people in a few ways that we'll talk about here before long. However, discrimination is now on the run against LGBTQ folks because here in the 21st century, really just your lifetime, it used to be decades to do these other things, LGBTQ rights has happened very quickly. Let's talk about it. First, we can begin in the realm of relationships. A famous case in Loris v. Texas concerned a couple men who were arrested for sodomy, for gay sex, having sex with each other. And there were sodomy laws across much of America saying that if you commit gay sex, especially between men, you are eligible for prosecution. And that's what happened here. A couple men were busted for it. As a result, ends up being a Supreme Court case. And the Supreme Court sided with the gay couple, or at least the gay relationships, saying that you cannot, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself here, saying that you cannot discriminate against gay sex. If you're not going to have any laws in the books saying that straight sex is bad here or there, you can't allow that and then ban gay sex. That is discriminatory and a violation of the 14th Amendment. Same thing with marriage laws. Many states over the course of my lifetime, the majority of my lifetime, banned gay marriages, including Missouri. Missouri had a ban. By the way, a ban on gay marriage is still in Missouri's Constitution right now. Right now. However, the Supreme Court has overruled that and all other states, saying that you cannot allow straight marriages while discriminating against gay marriages. Doing so is a violation of equal protection. It's a violation of the 14th Amendment. So again, this didn't happen until like the Obama administration. So this is very recent. This was the Bush administration. Most of you, I assume most of you are traditional age students. Most of you were toddlers or in diapers when this happened. So again, this happened very, very quickly. This isn't like a multi-decade fight like some of the other fields. Now, there are other areas in which gay people, I'm sorry, I always say gay because I grew up describing all LGBTQ rights as gay rights, but so that, my apologies. But there are other areas in which LGBTQ rights have advanced, such as serving in the military. For much of American history, they were not allowed to serve in the military. Even if you were closeted, you are not allowed to serve in the military. Now, this changed in the 90s. In the 90s, we have a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. DADT. Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And what Don't Ask, Don't Tell is trying to do is it's trying to have it both ways. You have a population of Americans that don't like the idea of gay people in the military, but then you have another population of gay Americans who want to serve in the military and want to defend their country. Well, under the Clinton administration, they reach a weird compromise called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You can be in the military and be gay, but you can't tell the military you're gay. That's called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and is very problematic for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons problematic is because it's very easy to tell. People who are gay usually don't need to tell you that they're gay, especially if you're serving the military with them and you're around each other 24/7. It's not hard to figure out who's straight and who's not straight. Now, on top of that, you actually had a lot of people in the military getting booted out of the military for being outed against their will. They didn't tell. They didn't tell. They weren't asked. They didn't tell. People just discovered through one means or another, like maybe they found a diary and in the diary was gay thoughts. Well, you weren't supposed to look through the diary. It was his personal possession, but you violated his privacy and now he's outed and can't serve in the military anymore. So I don't think I need to go on and on about this, but obviously this is a huge problem that nobody likes because now people are like, well, wait a minute. Straight people don't have to be closeted, but gay people have to be closeted? That doesn't seem particularly fair. And the people that don't want the gay people to serve in the military, well, now gay people are serving in the military. So you can see how this is a compromise on an issue, and this compromise makes nobody happy. Under the tail end of the Obama administration, or I guess I should say the middle of the Obama administration, the Pentagon conducted a military-wide study, and that military-wide study was over how concerned you'd be if you had to serve next to a person who happened to be homosexual. And the overwhelming response, this is the young generation for you here, the overwhelming response was that they didn't care if the person they're serving next to was gay or not. They cared if the person serving next to them had their back, of course. So as a result, now if you are homosexual, if you are LGBTQ, you can serve in the military. And you can serve openly. Now, the new front that's opened recently for LGBTQ rights is for work protections. Can you be fired for being gay? Well, shocker here, but for the vast majority of American history, you can be fired if your employer doesn't like the fact that you are LGBTQ. And there is no federal law on this. There is no federal law that protects you from being fired for being gay. As a result, it's left up to your state. Now, this was the case until 2020, the summer of 2020. And the Supreme Court of the United States, that's what SCOTUS means here, Supreme Court of the United States ruled in the summer of 2020. So now, as of 2020, you can no longer be fired for being gay. It's actually kind of an interesting Supreme Court case. You'd think that you'd have a lawyer arguing in front of the Supreme Court, you can't be discriminatory against gay people. That's homophobic. That's wrong. But that's not actually the argument the lawyer made. The argument the lawyer made was that it's sex discrimination. That's gender discrimination. If I show up to a work barbecue with my boyfriend, with my husband, and that bothers you and you fire me because of it, and you're not actually discriminating against me on the basis of sexual orientation. You and I might think that, but according to the Supreme Court, the problem is that you're firing somebody based on gender. Because if I was a woman and I brought my boyfriend or husband, you'd be fine with it. But I'm a man and I brought my husband and or boyfriend. Obviously, you have a problem with that. The Supreme Court ruled that was actually sex discrimination, not sexual orientation discrimination, interestingly enough. But nonetheless, that's how Supreme Court ruled back in the summer of 2020. So like I said, this stuff has happened very, very recently. Now, there are plenty of other fields we could get into civil rights. You don't need to know anything on this page. I just want to run through some civil rights debates that we have on a regular basis, such as what to do about people who have come to America illegally. Do they have access to our laws and protections? As we may have talked about before, most of these people who come to America are desperate. They're coming to America because their homelands are extremely dangerous for them or completely not providing for them. And they're trying to get a better opportunity here in America. So should they have access to our laws and protections? Maybe, maybe not. Do they have a right to remain in the United States under certain circumstances? Maybe, maybe not. Do they have any rights? Again, these are questions that don't have definitive answers, but they are questions about a category of person, and that makes them civil rights questions. On top of that, we can talk about felons and prisoners, people who are in jail right now, prisoners, people who are out of jail, they've served their time, such as felons. Prisoners, for instance, are actually afforded a comically low degree of protection against sexual assault. It's not comically, actually, it's morbidly comical, I guess I should say. The complete disregard they have to make sure that people who are in prison are protected from sexual assault. Prisoners are paid well below minimum wage. If they work for Unicor, it's usually like $1 an hour. Is that a violation of their civil rights? They're working a job. I know they're in prison, but they're working a job just like you and I are working a job. Is this therefore a violation of their rights? Maybe, maybe not. On top of that, convicted felons who serve their sentence and are released, few of them get their right to vote back across America. Is that discriminatory? Maybe, maybe not. We can talk about civil rights issues concerning the unborn. I mean, Roe v. Wade, we're familiar with Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade actually banned any laws that would ban safe and legal abortion. Now, with that in mind, this does beg the question, when exactly does the right of the mother begin? The right of the mother to make decisions end, and when does the right of the unborn begin? We don't have answers to this. Obviously, we'll have strong opinions on this, but there's no objective answer that our society can settle on. So, these civil rights questions are really important questions. They concern our brothers and sisters in society, and as a result, we just have to grapple with them democratically. So we've spent a lot of time talking about, so far talking about discrimination. Don't discriminate. Discrimination is a bad thing. Don't discriminate. Never discriminate. But did you actually know that it is constitutional to discriminate under certain circumstances? It is constitutional to discriminate under certain circumstances. Let's talk about the circumstances in which discrimination is allowed. And the answer here is it just depends. It depends what you're discriminating against. Now, there is a type of discrimination that is you need to meet the strictest possible standards if you want to be able to constitutionally discriminate. And we call that, well, actually, we'll get to that in a second. But if you are going to discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of religion or national origin, you need to meet the toughest standard possible. And that standard is strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny means you need to have a compelling government interest. A compelling government interest. Meaning you can discriminate constitutionally so long as the reason you have for doing so is compelling. Let me give you an example. Some inner cities have programs where they identify at-risk youth. Youth of every color under the rainbow, white, brown, black, you name it. As a result, one thing studies have shown to us is that kids when they are in their youth you have the best chance of making connections with them if you're trying to make a connection with them using an adult of the same gender and the same race. So, if you have an at-risk white girl, having an adult white woman reach out to her just the commonality in their life experiences is going to be the best possible chance to make a connection with her. If you have a brown boy having a grown brown man reach out to him, you're going to have the best possible chance of making connections with him. And that's compelling, right? We want to make sure that these kids stay on the straight and narrow, make sure that their futures stay intact. And so, under certain circumstances, if the person who's in charge of reaching out to like African American girls quits, well, then when we're hiring for somebody, we can actually give preference to African American women who apply for the job. Is that discriminatory? Sure it is, but it's justifiably discriminatory because what we're doing, the mission that we're on is compelling. We're trying to reach out to these girls under certain circumstances and do the best we can to help them out. You can also discriminate on the basis of gender. You can do that under certain circumstances. Now, the standard you're trying to meet here isn't as strict scrutiny, but it's what we call exacting scrutiny. Exacting scrutiny. And that means you got to have an important government interest. It doesn't need to be compelling, it just needs to be important. Now, discriminating on the basis of gender you might be thinking to yourself, why is it at a lower standard than race and religion? And to be honest with you, it's because there are actual differences between men and women. There's no real difference between a white man and a black man, or a person of a certain religion and another person who doesn't share that religion. But there are actual differences between men and women. And if you're wondering what's the difference between exacting and strict and important in government, we're kind of eyeballing it here, to be honest with you. There's no real scientific way of determining which is which, except to say that exacting is somewhat less strict than strict. So we're kind of just saying it's less strict. Still, you need an important government interest. Like, I'll give you an example. Next time you fly on a plane, you'll notice that the people patting down male passengers are men, and the people patting down female passengers are women. And if the female patter downer retires or gets another job somewhere, the TSA may very well prioritize hiring a woman for the position. And is that discriminatory? Yeah, but it's justifiable. We have an important interest in making sure that women who travel feel safe. And the best way to do that is having other women pat them down rather than men. And, men feeling safe as well by being patted down by a man. Now, you can actually discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation as well. Although, you'll notice that the standard starts to drop like a rock. First of all, if you discriminate on the basis of race, you have to meet a really strict scrutiny. If you're going to discriminate on the basis of exacting scrutiny, that's still really strong. But on the basis of sexual orientation, you really just need to have a rational basis, which is just any rational reason whatsoever. Okay? You can't refuse to hire a gay person because you heard gay people smell weird, right? That's insane. That's not a rational reason. But if you do arguably have a rational reason under certain circumstances, like maybe you're hiring for a car lot and a transgender person applies for the position, and you say to them, I don't know if we'll hire you because our customers are pretty traditional. I'm not sure they're going to buy cars from a transgendered person. Is that rational or not? I'll be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure the answer to that question, but you see how low the standard has fallen, right? The standard is real low here compared to, you just need a rational reason, anything that's not insane, compared to important government interests for women or, of course, compelling interests for people of races and religion. And that brings us to the last thing that we'll talk about in this chapter, and that is the very controversial topic of affirmative action. We're talking about affirmative action because this is one of the hottest civil rights debates that we have in America right now. Matter of fact, the Supreme Court is likely to rule on affirmative action over the course of, the next couple years. So what is affirmative action? Let's take a moment by putting up a definition. Here's your big definition. I'll give you just a moment on that. but it's a policy in education admissions or job hiring that gives special attention or compensatory treatment to traditionally disadvantaged groups to overcome the effects of past discrimination. One more time, it is a policy in education admissions or job hiring that gives special attention or compensatory treatment to traditionally disadvantaged groups to overcome the effects of past discrimination. All right, so what are they arguing here? Essentially, they're arguing that because certain categories of people, namely women, namely people of color, have faced so much discrimination over so many decades that, they are facing hardship at a higher rate than white males. And as a result, we need to offer them compensatory treatment. And sometimes that comes in the form of quotas. Like, we need to make sure that if you are a college that is admitting students, like MSU may admit you or may deny your application to be a student to MSU, that they are making reasonable efforts to make sure that a certain degree, certain percentage of their student body is female and or of course minorities. They need to make reasonable efforts on that front. Now, obviously, this makes a lot of sense. It also is very controversial and may need to be discarded depending on your perspective on this issue. Let's take a little time to talk about why affirmative action makes sense and why it doesn't make sense. Here is the debate. First, let's argue for affirmative action, shall we? The argument for affirmative action. We would like to think that all the people out there in America who are in charge of hiring for a job or admitting to a college, we would like to think that none of them are racist, none of them are sexist, but they gotta be out there, right? I mean, just statistically speaking, they gotta be out there. And if they are out there, affirmative action is a guaranteed check against any bias that they might have. It's not a cure-all, it's not a perfect solution, but it is a check at least against that prejudice. Now, aside from the overt prejudice, people who are straight up, racist or sexist or prejudiced in some way, research has shown that we all carry with us certain implicit biases that we may not even be aware that we have. Like, there was a study of kindergarten teachers that showed that they were they targeted students of color as troublemakers when they were operating on extremely little information. Now, does that mean that kindergarten teachers are racist or sexists? No, but we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. We tend to be innately suspicious of people who are not like us, and as a result, we can carry with us these implicit biases that we're not even aware of. As a result, once again, affirmative action is a guaranteed check against that problem. Affirmative action makes sense, let's keep it. Affirmative action doesn't make sense, let's get rid of it. Let's talk about the con side of this argument, okay? Now, obviously, one argument against the con is actually kind of co-opting the Martin Luther King argument, that I want my children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Well, affirmative action forces us to recognize the color of people's skin. It forces us to recognize gender. It forces us to, if we should be gender blind or colorblind, perhaps we should be. But affirmative action actually forces us to recognize those things rather than ignore them. On top of that, because affirmative action works over time to make sure that people of certain backgrounds that were discriminated against in the past, it is possible, it can happen once in a blue moon, that somebody in a discrimination group, maybe a minority, maybe a woman, may be hired over a more qualified person who happens to be in the majority race, which may be, white, probably white, or of course man. Now, I'm not suggesting this is common. But we know for a fact it does happen once in a blue moon because it ended up being a Supreme Court case. We know this because of fire departments primarily. Fire departments hire people differently than the rest of the jobs do. Fire departments run their candidates through a gamut of tests, and by the end of it, they're a number. And if you were hiring for 3 open positions and there's like 7 people applying, they'll hire the 3 highest numbers. Now, if all 3 numbers happen to be white males, but you have a 4th person who is not a white male, they're any other category you could think of, who got a really good score, they're just a wink behind person number 3, but they're a valuable, they're a minority, they are either a minority in race or a woman, we know for a fact that once in a blue moon, that person may in fact get the job over person number 3. Now, if this seems offensive or unfair, well, maybe we should get rid of affirmative action. These are the questions that the Supreme Court are going to be grappling with in the coming years. Oh, nothing like ending a chapter on a fun controversy, isn't that the case? Guys, this is a tough chapter, lots of ins and outs. Also, it's tough emotionally for some folks because learning about prejudice and people not liking other people for superfluous reasons, that's always kind of upsetting, at least to me. But nonetheless, Chapter 5, very important chapter. Make sure you know the stuff off the reading guide. Make sure you know the stuff off the study guide when it's time to prepare for the exam. In the meantime, I'll see you next time.